Okay, hello everybody. This is a very special week in the Humanities Centre silence programming. We might in fact call it Cage Week. As you all know, the work of John Cage is showcased in the exhibition behind me here, Quiet Vision. I would encourage you to take a look. And on Thursday, there is a very special performance of some of Cage's musical compositions for Silence's music of John Cage, which will take place this Thursday, March 5th, at 7:30 in Shiley Theatre in Camino Hall. It's a free event, so please come along and experience Cage's truly remarkable compositions. It's going to be stunning, and we are really very fortunate to have with us right now the three people who designed the concert and who will, with others, notably Christopher Adler, be performing the work. Christopher Adler is Professor of Music and Director of Asian Studies here at UST. He was educated at MIT, where he received bachelor's degrees in both mathematics and music composition. He subsequently went to Duke University, where he earned his PhD in composition. Dr. Adler's music as a composer and performer draws upon 30 years, more than 30 years, of research into the traditional musics of Thailand and Laos. He is a pianist with Noise, a frequent performer for San Diego New Music, and co-founder of the Sound On Festival in La Jolla. Among his many compositions is the truly remarkable Aeneas in the Underworld, concert-length oratorio for guitar and ensemble, recounting the sixth book of Virgil's Aeneid. In 2024, he was a US Fulbright Scholar in South Korea. Ryan Nestor was educated at the University of Kentucky, at Stony Brook University, and at UC San Diego, where he received his Doctor of Musical Arts degree. At USD, he teaches applied percussion along with a variety of music courses and is also the co-director with Dr. Charissa Noble of Ensemble X, USD's experimental ensemble, focusing on contemporary trends in sound art, storytelling, and performance. Dr. Nestor has premiered numerous works and has performed with groups such as Redfish Bluefish, International Contemporary Ensemble, and the Bang on a Can All-Stars. Performance highlights include appearances at Walt Disney Concert Hall, Cervantino Musical Festival, Ojai Music Festival, and the Old Globe Theatre, where he served as music director for the 2014 production of Othello. Charissa Noble is assistant professor in the Department of Music. She was educated at Biola University, San Diego State University, and at UC Santa Cruz, where she earned her PhD. Dr. Noble is a musicologist and vocalist. Her interdisciplinary research includes work on 20th century Californian art and music, experimental vocal practice, early electronic music, performance art, and popular music video aesthetics. Dr. Noble's work has appeared in such venues as the Journal of Musicological Research and Sound American, and she is executive director of San Diego New Music.
I'm no longer. I stepped away last season.
Oh,
sorry.
No. I'm sure it's gone downhill. So, I was going to say something about that, but I won't anymore. And so, exploring John Cage's idea that there is no such thing as silence, please welcome to the Humanities Centre, Charissa Noble, Chris Adler, Ryan Nestor.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And, I guess maybe is this mic how I'm going to be recorded? Yeah, okay, great. Or maybe I could just grab it. Oh, this This is always uncomfortable to watch somebody to do, isn't it? Hi. So today I want to open us up giving a little bit of an overview of Cage's life, and specifically Cage's work on silence, on this evolving project of his. A lot of people have a lot of perceptions about this, and so what I want to do is address some of those and disentangle them so we can really understand what he's doing. And this is meant to accompany our concert on Thursday, so I really hope that all of you, or at least many of you, can make it on Thursday. So I want to talk a little bit about 433 and the broader cultural imagination. This piece is very widely known, and if you don't even know John Cage's name, you might know about some avant-garde musical work that didn't have any sound in it. And so this lives in infamy sometimes, you could say, in our culture. So here's one such example, the John Cage carolers. And in this cartoon, you see that they all have their mouths closed. Typically, caroling involves singing, and these carolers are not. There's also this cartoon that I came across fortuitously on social media the other week. Somebody who really, I feel like this would be somebody in my seminar, honestly. I'm going up and doing John Cage as karaoke, not this guy again. Everybody's kind of rolling their eyes and groaning. And one of the reasons why this is funny is not just because of the hilarity of mixing this popular culture convention of karaoke with the high art seriousness of John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, but also because this exposes some of the ways that we think about this music and also a lot of contemporary art. 433 has become a cultural shorthand for the perceived excesses of modern art and the interpretive leap that it demands. But generously, some people think of 433 as a really interesting philosophical gesture, some kind of proto-conceptual art. Yet Cage sincerely intended his audience to experience 433 as music. He adopted rigorous compositional procedures. He utilized formal musical structures to delineate complex groupings of durational values in the making of 433. But why? Why go to all that trouble if this piece is just a thought experiment? So what I want to present to you is that the musicality of 433 actually sharpens its conceptual edge. If we compress 433 into a concept or a provocation, we miss the imperative that music as an art form places upon us to listen. And we miss the invitation that Cage offers us through silence to retune our attention to sound. So for Cage, silence was not absence, but method. He found that silence exposes culturally inscribed habits of listening. It reveals what these habits obscure about sound and musical activity, and it reshapes our attention, all of which bears significant implications beyond the scope of music. Silence was, in fact, a lifelong site of inquiry for Cage, and while 433 is his most famous of his silent works, it was only one of 4, which taken together demonstrate an evolving perspective on the part of Cage about silence, music, and listening. So in this talk, I will discuss Cage's 4 silent pieces, considering his use of silence as a strategy to address different musical, perceptual, and ethical questions. So let's start with his first piece, Silent Prayer. But this piece, of course, requires a little bit of backstory, right? We can't just start with the silent work. Where did he get this idea? What is he doing at this point in his life? So let's talk about what Cage was up to before he started exploring this concept of silence. So John Cage, he was a composer of mostly percussion music, and he was on the West Coast. A lot of New Yorkers try to claim him, and yes, he spent the majority of his life there, but no, I am reclaiming Cage as a Californian. He was an Angelino, but also he and his wife, Xenia, moved all over the West Coast, going as far north as the Cornish School in Seattle. So Cage, the composer of the silent piece, didn't write quiet music in his early years. He started composing music for his group, the John Cage Percussion Players, and this included his then-wife, Xenia Kashavarov, who with him salvaged ordinary objects from alleys and landfills, i.e. the original dumpster divers from Portland, supplemented by other instruments borrowed from their friends, such as Henry Cowell and Lou Harrison. So I want to play for you a little bit of what Cage's early music sounded like so that you get an idea. This is one of Cage's most performed and well-known percussion pieces from this era. This is called Third Construction, and this performance was specifically recommended by my excellent colleague, Ryan Nestor, who has very strong opinions about percussion performance. So I said, Ryan, I've got to have the best performance. What do you think is the best? So I share with you just a few minutes, or actually probably a few seconds, of this example of Cage's percussion work in his early career, Third Construction from 1941. Okay, I guess that's as good of a place to stop as any. I'm sure you probably recognized some household or maybe discardable items, or items that we would think as disposable amongst the percussionists, and they're side by side with global instruments. And this is very much a part of his life, especially on the West Coast in California. He's using what's at his disposal, and California was and continues to be one of the places where we have the most cultural diversity because it's a site for refugees and for migrants from all over the world. And this was happening even in the early 20th century, so Cage had the opportunity to be exposed to a lot of different instruments and cultures. And all of these were a way of him trying to explore how else can we discover and encounter sound. What sounds are there besides the ones that we're told to listen to in conventional musical listening? But this was, again, very early in his life. So it's not quiet. It's actually quite noisy in a lot of ways. But this is still very reflective of the project that he would embark upon later, which is a project of discovering and understanding silence in the context of musical experience and practice. Before Cage ever considers writing a silent piece, he's thinking about music as experimentation and sonic discovery, and importantly, not self-expression. In fact, in one of his earliest published essays that was published in, hold on, oh, the clicker doesn't want to work. Oh, is it because, well, let's see, here we go. So this is one of Cage's earliest published works in Dune Forum. This was published out of San Luis Obispo from a radical alternative community called the Dunites. And Cage published an entire essay recounting his ideas on modern art and music. And he called it, interestingly enough, Counterpoint. And throughout this piece, Cage is talking about wanting to sidestep personal expression. He's saying music is a concrete and physical experience. That's what I want my listeners to encounter. And one of his most pointed statements in this essay is, I think of music not as self-expression, but as expression. What is he saying here? He's saying that music is not something that is just primarily about personal expression. In fact, it doesn't have to be at all. But instead, he's proposing music can be a structured, shared experience that is physical and in real time, and without abstraction, without symbolism, and without emotional disclosure. What's striking, though, is that it takes Cage nearly 2 decades to find a method that truly allows him to do what he suggests in Dune Forum in 1934. But eventually, silence is what becomes this method. So now, with that preamble, let's talk about his first silent work, Silent Prayer, in 1948. So it's actually a little bit misleading to call this piece a work. Let's quote from it here. He was reading a lecture at Vassar College in 1948, and he says in that lecture he would like to compose a piece of uninterrupted silence and to sell it to Muzak Company, and its title will be Silent Prayer. So it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek here. He's, of course, making a joke. He famously had a great sense of humor and laughed a lot. So I'm sure his audience was chuckling when he said this, but I think this also revealed something sincere about his interests at the time. He was really interested in how silence could be used as content in music, and what silence does when you frame it through a musical listening experience. And how do you do that? So in his earlier years, since Cage was writing percussion music, and a lot of this percussion battery that he had acquired didn't have any conventional notation, so how do you write for it? You use time structures. So he thought, well, if I use time structures, I can incorporate any kind of sound, and I can incorporate silence. So how does that work? And so at this point in his life, he's like, what if I just write a piece that is all silence? What does that do to your listening? And so this is what he's suggesting at Vassar. We have no evidence of this piece. There are no sketches, no other extant evidence, but it shows where Cage was at this time. And this is the beginning of his exploration of silence as a method of musical discovery and attuning our attention. But at this point, it's still pretty early. Silence is used as content for Cage, and it's idealizing this stillness that you experience when no intentional sound is made. So Cage goes on to other opportunities. One of these most formational experiences that led up to his first, I would say, truly silent piece, 433, was his encounter with Robert Rauschenberg. So he met Rauschenberg at Black Mountain College during a residency in 1948, and Robert Rauschenberg later painted these series of paintings called white paintings, and he used the white paint that you would use on like the side of a house. It wasn't fine art materials. So I think Cage saw himself in that because he's upcycling essentially garbage for his percussion instruments. So he probably saw Robert Rauschenberg also working with materials that are often not thought of as fine or worthy of attention. And so these white paintings in 1951 really impacted Cage's thinking. He called these paintings airports for lights, shadows, and particles. And so this really started to get Cage thinking about stillness and how you can cultivate that stillness. So Cage took it a step further. He thought, okay, well, that's the visual art medium. What about sound? What do I do? So he decided that he wanted to go and visit the Harvard Anechoic Chamber, which had been built just a few years ago. And he said, hey, can I go in? They said, sure, that's great. Yeah, just report back. So he goes in there and he sits for a bit. And then he comes back out and they say, okay, well, what was it like? And he goes, I heard sounds. Are you sure this thing works? They're like, we're Harvard. Yes, it works. I don't know if they said it that smugly, but maybe they did. So Cage comes out and he goes, no, I heard two sounds. I heard one high pitch sound that was constant and one low pulsing sound. They go, oh, yeah. Well, in a room that's that silent, because what an anechoic chamber does is it makes sound reflection impossible through the surfaces in the room. They're all spongy. What that sound absorption does is it makes you able to hear the sounds of your own body. So the high-pitched sound that you heard was your nervous system, and the low pulsation was your blood. And this changed Cage forever. He frequently recalled this story. And the reason why is because this is when he realized there's no such thing as silence. There's no such thing as silence. This changed Cage forever. This totally altered the course of his composition and gave him a method to realize his desire to sidestep personal expression, to present us with sound on its own terms. The logic is, for Cage, that there's always sound in the world, so much that most of it goes unnoticed. So if there's always sound, the music doesn't start with content. It starts with listening. Now, here's the problem. Concert listening is full of habits, expectations about what to pay attention to. God forbid your phone goes off or you unwrap a candy that's kind of noisy during Mahler 2. How dare you, right? So music concert listening is full of habits, expectations about what you're supposed to pay attention to and what you are supposed to summarily ignore. What matters? What counts as music in the first place, and what music is supposed to express or mean to the audience. So Cage is asking a pretty big question here. Well, how do you change listening itself? And this is where silence for Cage becomes a method, and it becomes first demonstrated as a method in 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So this is the piece that we'll talk about next. So 433 was made in 1952, and Cage said famously, I wrote it note by note. It was done just like a piece of music. I think his own language betrays him there. Cage, it is music. You said so. So he says it was done just like a piece of music, except there were no sounds, but there were durations. What does he mean by that? So what Cage meant is that he is using a meticulous compositional process of measuring out note value durations using structural procedures and chance operations, which my colleague Dr. Adler will talk about in his lecture. And he built this piece out of these calculated durations. Hold on, let me catch up with myself. I got ahead of myself because I'm so excited about all of this. And so this piece, that is made of a meticulous musical process, actually formally musical process, was premiered by his good friend David Tudor in 1952 at the Maverick Concert Hall in Woodstock, New York. And it had 3 movements. So you might think, oh, this is just a silent piece, so you just sit there for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. No, David Tudor looked at where the movements were, and so he indicated the beginning and the ends of the movements by opening and closing the piano lid, indicating intentionally when he was not making sound. What's interesting, though, about this piece is that as radical as it seemed, and it was radical, and it continues to shock people. Actually, I have a fun little anecdote. As the executive director of San Diego New Music, I sit in the audience, and I try to sit closer to the back. Sometimes I get forced to be in the front because I have to talk about the pieces, but mostly I try to sit in the back. And so one time when I was sitting in the back and 433 was on one of our concert programs, I heard this man lean over to whoever was sitting next to him. At first I thought it was his wife, but actually it was a stranger, which makes it even weirder. But he leans over and he goes, "This is like bullshit, right?" And I was like, this is amazing. It's 2018 and Cage still is shocking audiences. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But actually, despite this piece's shocking lack of intended sound on the part of the performer, this piece actually has a lot of the conventional trappings of music. It has a composer, it has a score, it has a performer. It's performed on a stage, and in the premiere, on the stage with a conventional classical musical instrument, a piano, and in front of an audience. These are all musical conventions that structure our listening in a particular way. They create what you might call an invisible frame for our listening. So what does silence do? Silence exposes this frame and repurposes its pressures on our attention to form a new frame, one that recenters listening as the primary activity within music as opposed to sounding. So in this piece, you could say that silence is a frame for listening. That's Cage's methodological approach here, using silence. It's a frame for listening. It doesn't tell a story. It doesn't impose a feeling or display virtuosity or expressivity on the part of the performer. It asks, what do you hear? And what do you notice about it? So now let's talk about 0 minutes and 0 seconds, Cage's next silent piece, often titled 4 minutes and 33 seconds, number 2. So this piece continues Cage's musical to perceptual line of inquiry that he began with 433. However, it's notably different from 433 in a lot of really important ways. Let's take a look at this piece in detail. So first, Cage explains much later in his life about this piece that it's trying to say everything we do is music, or it can be through the use of microphones. And so this piece was premiered in October 1962 in Tokyo. Cage actually went to Tokyo several times throughout his life. And it has, instead of a traditional score, texted instructions that direct the performer to complete some kind of an action and amplify it. So let's take a work. It says, in a situation provided with maximal amplification, no feedback, he's like, I don't want anybody going, ouch, in the audience, perform a disciplined action with utter seriousness and fulfilling in whole or in part an obligation to others. Apologies, it's a bit blurry. And two performers to be of the same action. May that action be the performance of a musical composition. No attention to be given to the situation, electronic, musical, theatrical. So he's trying to say, do something, amplify it, but also don't draw a bunch of attention to yourself, even though this is a musical performance. What? Let's talk about this a little bit. Let's unpack it. And so I think that what this piece is trying to do is correct, or maybe not correct, maybe that's the wrong word, but adjust some of what didn't work about 433 in Cage's project to use silence as a method for tuning our attention. So this piece is markedly different from 433. There's no prescription on the performer, like you don't have to do a specific action. There's no defined length of time. It's 0 minutes, 0 seconds. So it's however long that action takes, I suppose. And the action and its duration are thus totally open to the performance situation. So how is this piece silent? Why do we call this a silent piece, especially if it's amplified? If, say, I've performed this piece before with friends, and we were doing a bunch of different pieces and playing them at the same time. So she decided she was going to make soup for the audience. So she's chopping, and especially when she got into that fennel, it was loud. This piece is not quiet. So what is being silenced here, and what work is silence doing in this piece? So I think that silence is conceptual here. Cage is silencing the conventions of music that remained in 433, but he's testing what emerges when all of the structural conditions of conventionally defined musical activity and listening are removed. So what he's highlighting here is sound that results from ordinary action. And he's highlighting that amplification brings these typically overlooked or perhaps silent sounds to the center of our attention and into our focus. So I'd say here that silence is the condition for action to be heard in 0 minutes and 0 seconds. So now let's talk about Cage's last piece, 1-3. This is his third version of 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So here's the story of this piece. So John Cage was being awarded the Kyoto Prize in October 1989, and then he would travel there in November. So they requested, hey, can you do the hits? This is essentially like avant-garde music's Freebird. You know what I mean? They're like, come on, can you please do 4 minutes and 33 seconds? And Cage is like, I don't want to do that piece anymore. So he sent over a fax through his management art services, which was run by Mimi Johnson, who was a good friend of John Cage and the wife of another avant-garde composer, Robert Ashley. And so she writes to the Kyoto Prize organization, Cage would not like to perform 433. He'd like to perform a new work, which is a redoing of 4 minutes and 33 seconds. And there are some texted instructions here. So let's look at them. So this is actually the only quote-unquote score that exists of this piece is the fax that he sent to the Kyoto Prize organization. And he says, you should arrange the sound system so that the whole hall is just on the edge of feedback. Not actually feeding back, but feeling like it might. Do you know what this actually means in practice? There's going to be feedback. Have any of you been to academic assembly? Feedback is kind of inevitable, right? So no piano is necessary, he specifies. So he's really trying to distance himself from his origin story of 433 at this point. Why? Not because he doesn't love 433, but because he's doing something new and his thinking is changing, and he wants to bring us along on this journey with him. So this is Cage's most radical silencing. He's, again, conceptually silencing like he did in 0 minutes and 0 seconds. There's no composer. That role is silenced. There's no score. There's no performer. There's no time frame. And there's no specific action. This piece offers us only amplification of amplification itself. So the silence in this piece is once again something that draws our attention to that which goes unnoticed. So in this case, it's the ubiquity of amplified sound, and by extension, the increasing technological mediation of our experience of the world. So what Cage is doing in this piece is he's exposing this phenomenon through the microphone's auto-generated distortion brought about by the silencing of its intended purpose, i.e. to amplify something or someone. Cage said about this piece when asked what it means, it's pretty bleak. We are no longer certain that there will be any silence. We are no longer certain that there will be a world. And I did some number crunching on the dates here. He said this in November 1989. I don't have the exact date, but that also is the same month and year that the Berlin Wall fell. So I think that this is, I don't know, I think a response to some of the tensions, especially around technology that was happening in the Cold War. So I want to leave you with something a little bit less bleak, though. Taken together, Cage's 4 silent works and their exploration of sound experience through silence depicts a posture of curiosity, of nuance, of openness to the world, all grounded in the physical reality of music. The ethical implications of silence as a method of sound discovery and perceptual awareness, forgive the pun, tacitly, because in 433 it says tacitly, and yet loudly, embraces the world and its constituents on its own terms, noticing, not demanding, but always listening. So now I want to leave you with Cage himself talking about his feeling about sounds at the end of his life.
That finally said, you mean it's just sounds? Thinking that for something to just be a sound is to be useless. Whereas I love sounds just as they are. And I have no need for them to be anything more than what they are. I don't want them to be psychological. I don't want a sound to pretend that it's a bucket or that it's a president or that it's in love with another sound. I just want it to be a sound.
So I hope that you love sounds just as they are, especially after attending our concert on Thursday. Please join us on Thursday. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'm going to read the first half of my paper because I need to stay organized, and I'll talk a little freely at the end. So, I am just old enough to have seen Cage in person when I was a high school student in 1989, just 3 years before his death. Seems like we connected there just perfectly. I went to the Strathmore Arts Center in Maryland to see him perform. By this point, he was popularly regarded as a kind of gentle grandfather of American contemporary music. And just 1 year later, he would be featured on an episode of PBS's American Masters. That's a sign that you've made it, right? But the conventional wisdom was also that while his ideas were inspirational, no one really listens to his music, except for the early pre-experimental pieces. After Cage made a trip to Europe to perform in 1949, he entered into an intense friendship and short-lived correspondence with French modernist composer Pierre Boulez. In the immediate post-war era, both composers imagined themselves reinventing music from the ground up, discarding all prior tradition, finding motivation from a sense of historical necessity and from their mutual admiration. Cage's compositional method at the time of using charts of predetermined material was empowering. By making moves on the charts, I freed myself from what I had thought to be freedom, and which was actually only the accretion of habits and tastes. While Boulez opted for rigorous systems of controlling musical material, Cage at this point suddenly embraced chance, and their correspondence gradually evaporated as both realized they were headed in diametrically opposed directions. In 1954, Boulez wrote to Cage, "I do not admit, and I believe I will never admit, chance as a component of a completed work. I am widening the possibilities of strict or free music, constrained or not, but as for chance, the thought of it is unbearable." And by 1964, he is publishing extended academic diatribes against chance composition, and by implication, Cage. Cage's use of chance was so antithetical to the conventional notion that music was expressive that for decades he was called upon again and again to defend against the criticism that chance was lazy. For example, from an interview in 1976, chance is not a giving up of responsibility. It is a shifting responsibility from answers to the questions. It is attention to structure. This dichotomy between rigorous systems of control and an acceptance of chance and indeterminacy would remain fiercely oppositional stances in American new music, sometimes along imagined lines of uptown, downtown, or East Coast, West Coast, and would simmer among graduate composition departments for another 50 years. Because I know, I went to graduate school around then, and it was still simmering. Like, people had these debates. They really cared. In the 1940s, as Cage settled into a new life in New York, he was struggling with personal relationships with his wife Xenia and with dancer Merce Cunningham. And his compositions at the time, which were autobiographical and expressive of this struggle, were being poorly received. He sought solace and guidance in exploring a potpourri of contemplative traditions. From Indian musician Gita Sarabhai and from reading Sri Ramakrishna and Ananda Kumara Swami, he learned Hindu ideas. He read the medieval German mystic Meister Eckhart, and he learned about Zen Buddhism, in part from an influx of used books coming out of post-war Japan. And then from Zen Buddhist advocate and speaker Daisetsu Suzuki. From these, he appropriated a bricolage of ideas tailored to his own purposes, which framed a personal philosophy for life and for his musical practice. They helped him to envision a new path for his music, one not based on expression and autobiography, but oriented towards a non-differentiation between art and life. But he was not a devotee of any religious practice. He readily ignored aspects that did not suit his interest. In fact, musicologist James Pritchett, one of the foremost Cage scholars, suggests that Cage, as a, quote, serial enthusiast, not serial music, but as in getting enthusiasm for one thing after another. Only two people got that joke. He searched through these religious traditions to affirm what he already knew about experimental music, and that his, quote, this is Pritchett, involvement with Buddhism never went any deeper than that first flush of enthusiasm. Nonetheless, biographer Kay Larson points out that Cage emerges from this period less self-obsessed, more joyous and energetic, and well on his way to becoming that gentle grandfather I recognized from my youth. I highlight here just a few key ideas that help illustrate this move away from expression and towards chance composition. From both Coomaraswamy and Eckhart, that the purpose of music is not to express oneself, but to imitate nature in her manner of operation. From Buddhism, a critique of the ego as separating art from life. And from Suzuki's lectures at Columbia University on Huayan Buddhism, a notion of the interpenetratedness of all things, an interpretation of the Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination, positing that one may readily and suddenly obtain a realization of the ultimate because the Buddha nature is already present in all things, including oneself. Cage imagined this universal truth realized in the domain of music through juxtaposing any sounds and any silences through the infinitude of combinations made possible by the application of chance procedures. Amidst this torrent of ideas, Cage's statements about silence are both evolving and contradictory. In 1951, Cage would write to Boulez that chance was throwing sound into silence. And around the same time, in the lecture on something, that each something is a celebration of the nothing that supports it. While these suggest a kind of figure-ground relationship between sound and silence, Cage's compositions at that time used charts of musical materials in which sounds and silences are treated equally, and both sharing the fundamental characteristic of duration. And in fact, structuring durations had been his primary method of organizing material for over a decade. But with the experience of the anechoic chamber and the composition of 433 in 1952, Cage posits that silence is not an absence of sound, but the experience of unintended sound. Composing with chance is a practice of non-intention, so the conclusion may be that chance compositions are silent, perhaps meaning not silent of sound, but silent of ego. The catalyst in Cage's process of inventing chance composition arrives in 1950 by fortuitous circumstance of a gift from composer Christian Wolff, an English translation of the Chinese divination manual, the I Ching, which dates back 3,000 years. By tossing sticks or coins, one obtains a hexagram from 64 possibilities, from which guidance or fortune can then be read. In addition to its Eastern mysticism, I think Cage was drawn to its tactility and its disciplined but accessible method. His personal letters at the time also reveal him consulting the I Ching not just for making music, but as a kind of personal counselor, tossing coins in response to events or interactions with people. As I mentioned earlier, Cage's method of composing at this time involved charts of musical material from which he would string together compositional choices. Seeing the charts of the hexagrams in the I Ching, Cage immediately recognized the parallel to his compositional charts, realizing that he could replace conscious decisions with a toss of coins to select elements from the charts. He applies this in the third movement of the piece he was writing. He was in the midst of writing at the time, the concerto for prepared piano and orchestra. Cage then immediately goes all in, laboriously spending the remainder of 1951 conceiving and executing the most rigorously chance-determined piece of his entire catalog, the piano solo, Music of Changes. He prepared 8x8 charts of musical materials like that seen here. Now, if you look carefully here, there's like a grid here of 4x8, and he's got music written in. If imagine that music is on the red squares of a checkerboard, all the black squares are silences. Then you get the 64, which looks just like the chart from the I Ching. He prepares similar charts of rhythms, dynamics, articulations, like how you play, tempos, pedaling, charts that would determine aspects of musical organization, and charts that would describe how they change over time. He considered every possible musical parameter of decision-making and made a chart for it. He then composed by making all determinations using the I Ching, painstakingly constructing a radically experimental and extremely challenging composition. It is thus possible to make a musical composition the continuity of which is free of individual taste and memory, and also of the literature and traditions of art. The sounds enter the space-time centered within themselves, unimpeded by service to any abstraction, their 360 degrees of circumference free for an infinite play of interpenetration. There's the first page of the score, and this is what it sounds like. Kind of hate to stop it, but we can talk. You can ask me about this later. I actually really like to listen to that one. Not long after, like a year and a half after, he envisions a magnum opus, a never-ending project of chance compositions that would explore all possible sounds that instruments could make. These compositions would be based on a structure of proportions, 100 sections, each comprised of 100 units, giving this meta-project its title, The 10,000 Things. As a multi-work, the compositions of the 10,000 Things could be performed alone or in combination, and in combination with the lecture, 45 Minutes for a Speaker, which is also based on the same structure of proportions, and comprises a collage of chance-selected excerpts from his prior writings. He ultimately completed only 4 compositions before moving on to other things. And on our concert on Thursday, we will present 2 of them along with 45 Minutes for a Speaker. So I want to just walk you through some of the aspects of this piece that make it kind of exciting. First of all, 31, 57, 9, 8, 6, 4 for a pianist, that's the duration that results from the combinations of chance calculations that from which it's assembled, just like 433 is assembled from a series of random determinations. It's for prepared piano. And if you're not familiar with the prepared piano, it's one of the things for which Cage is most famous behind just 433. And the idea is that you stick various objects in between the strings of the piano to change the sound. But importantly, it doesn't just change the sound. Well, the thing that makes a piano is the kind of uniformity of tone that you put across the whole thing. So you can make beautiful chords and beautiful melodies because it blends with itself. Putting things in between the strings causes every note to sound completely different. They're unrelated to one another. It essentially turns it into a one-person percussion orchestra. And each sound could actually be complex in and of itself. So this is kind of what Cage was doing with percussion. He turns the piano into this and writes all kinds of magnificent music for it. These are his last 31 and 34 are his last major compositions for prepared piano. It was invented, incidentally, in 1940. So here's the score. You can see it's a formidable-looking score with some aspects of conventional notation. It's got some lines, but he's invented all kinds of new things as well, horizontal lines that may or may not determine the durations of notes. Preparations in the piano actually change through the course of performance, which is quite challenging. That's what these things are, saying how to reach in and move things around while one is playing. And then he makes an attempt at sort of parametrically deconstructing the action of playing the piano. Instead of saying, this is a loud note, this is a soft note, he breaks it down into these zones. The degree of force, I forget what they are, the height at which you're supposed to strike the key and the speed you're supposed to strike the key. Now, it turns out this actually doesn't work. You cannot separate these things in any meaningful way. So that is, in a sense, an aspect of his experimental music. It was an experiment that failed, but he learned from it. So there's ways to read it, but there's some kind of useless information on the page, too. Here's a little bit of me rehearsing this piece a couple days ago, so you can see my piano's full of stuff. And this will give you, and you'll notice also, he's really treating the piano as an entire sound-making body. It's not just about playing on the keys, it's about plucking the strings, striking inside, striking outside, and then there's also stuff that's off the piano entirely. Yeah, there's the that was for prepared pinky. Okay, so another piece in the set that you will hear on Thursday is 27 minutes for percussionists. Ryan's also going to talk about this one. Also contains extreme challenges of really requesting vastly more events than one human can play. So he suggests that the performer prepare an electronic track with some of the parts pre-recorded. And so we've been working on that for the last couple months. And he invents, again, all kinds of new notational innovations. One of the interesting things about this piece is that he doesn't really tell you what to play it on. He says you should have this really big, impressive setup, and it should be a virtuoso performance. But all that's indicated are metals, so anything made of metal, anything made of wood, things with skins, and then all others. So literally everything is potentially available as an instrument, and I think we'll enjoy that in Ryan's performance. There will be quite a bit of everything. Yep. With the I'll just show you this because I think it's so cool. Another piece, and in a way, the one that's perhaps most innovative from this set, the 10,000 Things, is 26 minutes for a string player. Because here his attempts to parametrically deconstruct the notation and the way you play a stringed instrument were successful. And it's amazing. So obviously this looks nothing like conventional music. This is a radically new way of displaying musical information. What you see here are 4 big zones. That corresponds to the 4 strings of an instrument, any stringed instrument, violin, viola, cello, bass, whatever you want to use, generally those 4. Up at the top is various actions of the bow, and so you have to sort of look at the key and see what all those things mean. And at the bottom are sounds that you can produce using the instrument or not the instrument that don't use the bow. But it's just completely deconstructed. And so typically when you play a stringed instrument, the actions of your hand to stop a note, the actions of they're all correlated in a way that you learn. His idea is to get away from tradition by completely decorrelating everything and determining the actions independently. We really wanted to put this piece on the program, but it turns out this is really hard to do. And we had a hard time finding anybody who was willing to do it. And then we ran out of time because it takes a lot of time to put together. So this one is not performed that often. But what's fascinating for me about this is this idea of the parametric decomposition of musical notation and of physical action becomes a really important aspect of a movement called the New Complexity decades later. And it's just like one more of those things that somehow Cage saw before anybody else did. It's really amazing. This is what it sounds like, and this does correspond to the excerpt on the screen. There you go. So you get the idea. It's fascinating and intense. So the way we're going to be performing these the 2 compositions and the lecture 45 minutes for speakers, that they are performed simultaneously, but they are not coordinated. They're all composed according to clock time, but we use chance operations to determine when the 3 parts start. And part of the idea is that the coincidence of these 3 things, which works out, continues to produce that sort of sense of interpenetratedness of sound and silence in a way that is not predictable. So before I stop, I just want to mention 2 books that if you're curious to read more about John Cage that aren't really the standard sources. These are very sort of I think illuminating and interesting. Recently just published The Selected Letters of John Cage. very good. And then also this biography by Kay Larson, which really focuses on the sort of religious and spiritual side of Cage's development. So thank you very much.
Very much. Again, I think we're all just really happy that we could be here today to talk about music that we love, ideas that we find super fascinating. Just on a quick personal note, I mean, it was John Cage's music that like propelled me into the type of music that I like to do today. I mean, at a very young age in my early university years. Excuse me. A couple of things that both of my colleagues have made me think about as I sat here that I want to start with in my talk, which mostly is going to focus on the indeterminate works of John Cage, his use of indeterminacy, which I'll explain here in a moment, and then finally how I, as a percussionist and a performer and an interpreter of Cage, how I go about trying to realize his work in a way that I think is sound. So that's what I'm going to try to focus on today in the short time that we have remaining. So I think it's clear by now that Cage was a brilliant artist, and he was thinking on a super deep level. He was a prolific composer. He wrote so much music, and we're putting on our concert on Thursday and showing some truly masterful compositions, but they are a tiny fraction of what Cage did. And not only was he prolific, Cage is one of those unique composers who was able to reinvent how he composed again and again and again, and probably again, in a way that almost no composer actually does. It's really remarkable. And so some of the early percussion works were mentioned by Charissa. And of course, those were all like determined compositions. Every note is there. And yet they had this incredible formal construction going on deep down on a deeper level. His use of percussion, which maybe some of you don't know, this was like super revolutionary. And it came at a time where, electronic instruments or electronic sounds were still quite new to the world, and percussion music was this sort of like response to early electronic sounds, but also the noisiness of the 20th century. So there Cage was again, embracing percussion. The prepared piano was mentioned, and if I'm not mistaken, correct me, but the prepared piano was this sort of invention of his that came out of necessity, right? He was working with dancers, and he's in a small space. He wanted his percussion instruments. They either weren't in town or they couldn't fit on in the room. So he said, I'll put nuts and bolts in the piano. And then he creates these masterworks, and so again and again, creating new ideas, embracing new sounds. I think one of his most enduring and fascinating concepts that he incorporated again into a number of works over a number of years was this sort of the ways he explored distancing himself from the sounding result, the way he relinquished control in many ways from the final product, the way he took a step back and said, I'll have some authorship, but not complete authorship. And so we see this in the chants music, and that's kind of where I want to start. I'm going to basically segue out of Chris's talk and go into indeterminacy. But before I do, I think it's worthwhile just really making sure it's clear, like to Cage, what is chants music, right, in his words? Because anytime you start talking about randomness, chants, aleatoric composition, stochastic composition, all these terms kind of get muddled depending on the composer you're speaking about or where in the world this idea is being discussed. So I'm going to talk about how Cage used these terms, and just Cage. So when Cage talked about chants music, he was talking about a process of composition, like the way he was creating music. And the way he was creating music was to develop procedures or to utilize something like the I Ching to determine specific elements of the music. All right, so this is an example of how he was distancing himself from the music. It wasn't his note, it was fate's note, right? Fate chose this duration of a sound. Fate chose a B flat at this particular moment. It wasn't him. It was his idea, but it wasn't his sound. And so when he uses that word, that's what he's talking about, was the procedure that determined the random information that he would then use without bias. Whatever it said, that's what he would do. And Music of Changes, the massive, complex solo piece for piano from 1951, again, to underscore Chris, every aspect, for all intents and purposes, was determined through hundreds, if not thousands, of chance-determined procedures. I think that's the right way of saying it. So it's his idea, but the notes, durations, articulations, pedalings, etc., they were not his. Chance determined those. By the mid-1950s, I think this was becoming less interesting to him, because although he had freed sounds and removed himself from authorship to a certain extent, I think he was just becoming more interested in scores that could be performed in a variety of ways. Something that has more malleability, perhaps giving performers themselves a bit of ownership of how the sound of the work is going to come off, rather than in a chance piece, which is completely determined and completely fixed. So Music of Changes, anywhere you go in the world, if you hear a performance of it, it will sound the same. I mean, of course, performative aspects aside, the piece is always the same. Just as a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, performed by San Diego Symphony, sounds the same, more or less, as Berlin Philharmonic, right? They're orchestras playing a specific piece of music. Music of Changes is fully determined through a chance process. So he liked the fact that he hadn't authored all of it, right? But it felt a little too fixed, a little too determined, and it wasn't flexible. Thus, we enter his period of indeterminate composition, which means that some elements of the music, some elements, not all, but some elements are going to be unspecified. Now, what does that mean? Well, he's going to give you the framework. He's going to give you some aspects that are fixed. But then he's going to say, this part over here, it's up to you, the performer. And so what this created was a huge variety of potential performance outcomes. And before I jump into the examples of the music, I just want to say that indeterminate composition, unlike his chance composition, which was, again, very fixed, it was determined. Once it happened, that was it. His work with indeterminacy is a little more nuanced. Some of his works have just a touch of indeterminacy. I can point to a work as far back as 1942, the Credo in Us, which actually Chris and I have played together a couple of years ago, which is a largely traditionally notated composition for 4 people, for piano, 2 percussionists, and then the strange part, the performer who plays the phonograph and the radio. So it's all notated in a very traditional way, but there is an element of indeterminacy here. And the element of indeterminacy is what record are you going to put on the phonograph? All he tells you is maybe use a classic like Dvorak, Beethoven, Sibelius, or Shostakovich. And so the piece starts with the phonograph player going, drop the needle. And whatever record they've chosen, the performer has chosen, that's how the piece starts. And it fades out, and then the banging of the percussion and piano takes over, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with that classical music. My point is that is actually an example of indeterminacy. It's a seed of an idea that he doesn't really manifest fully until, 12, 13 more years. So to go back, a lot of this is on a spectrum. And I just want to underscore that many of his so-called indeterminate works, which really begin about 1957 and go through to the end of his life, many of them still utilize chance procedures. They still incorporate I Ching or other kinds of specific procedures that produce random results. So he's still allowing fate to determine certain aspects. But it's this inclusion of certain parts of the music being left to the performer that really made his music malleable is the word I like. It's much more, it's a living thing rather than a predetermined fixed thing that will never change. And so if the definitions are clear, then I would want to move forward to not this, but this, yeah. And so if you take this first sort of example of a seed of indeterminacy being in 1942, the Credo in Us, where the phonograph player chooses a record that is now and again performed amidst the cacophony of piano and percussion. That's one idea. And then you get into the period where he's composing the 10,000 Things. Now, those pieces were all produced with radical and radical chance procedures. I don't know if you actually mentioned it, but he often would take a piece of large paper, find imperfections in that piece of paper, color them in, and those became the notes. And so the piece of paper literally determined the outcome. And 2710.554 for percussion is, in many cases, that's how the notes came to be. But that said, this idea of indeterminacy has already started to infiltrate his chance works. And in 27 minutes, 10.554 seconds for percussion, though it's largely chance determined, he leaves the performer a bunch of choices. He says, again, I know Chris already said this, but he says the percussionist should come up with an array of metal instruments, wooden instruments, skinned instruments. Everybody probably knows, like, drum head has a skin. It used to be that you use an animal hide. Today we generally use plastic. And then, yes, this category of all others. Okay, so he tells you the overall material, but the instruments are left up to you. And if you've seen a percussionist like me, we have a lot of different sounds, right? It can be overwhelming how many things that we could hit at any given moment. But he does provide some categories, right? He tells you on clock time, he gives you the second marking, so that's specific. And then he places what I would call the attack point, that is the beginning of the sounds, very clearly within or on every second. And just so you understand, the top line here, second, the third, and the fourth. There's 4 staves on every page of the score. Each stave is 15 seconds long. So a page is 1 minute, and there's, of course, 27 minutes and 10 seconds total. And so the dots and the lines, well, these are events. But again, like with a percussion instrument, just the nature of our instruments, some instruments have a very short sound. Other instruments, like a drum or a big gong, by design, they have a very long resonance pattern. Cage isn't really accounting for any of that because it doesn't matter really. It's up to the performer. So there is this latitude that he's already inserting into an otherwise determined composition. Okay, and so just moving forward, in 1957, this is where his true indeterminacy period begins. And And again, it goes to the end of his life, this idea of indeterminacy within a composition. But if you really want to demarcate the period of indeterminate composition, it's probably about 1957 to 1961. And this is maybe the first true, fully indeterminate work, or at least 90% of it is probably indeterminate. Winter music for 1 to 20 pianos. This is wild. Okay, buckle up. Is a score containing 20 pages, and on those pages, you'll find between 1 and 61 chords. Great. Those chords are paired with a very ambiguous set of clefs. In some cases, the chords are accompanied by a pair of treble clefs, which tell you, which give us information about which notes to play. And in other cases, he provides bass clefs. Where the clefs don't match, he tells you, well, a certain number of the notes should be in one clef and the rest of them should be in the other clef. And he even gives you numbers. He gives you ratios. For instance, right there, it says 3-6. So he says, in this chord, 3 of the notes should be in treble and 6 in bass, or 3 in bass and 6 in treble. And so you can imagine, just with that information, the variability in a performance is basically infinite. There will never be 2 performances that sound the same, even with just that. And then he says the performers can choose on each page of the 20 pages which chords they would like to perform. And you can choose the order of the pages that you would like to play. So it's literally impossible to ever reproduce the same performance. So he's giving you traditional notation. He's giving you traditional musical clefs, notes, but he doesn't tell you anything about rhythm or duration. He doesn't tell you much other than it's choose your own adventure. And, he is basically given the performers this autonomy. He has created the conditions, and it's up to the performers now to create an interpretation. So I think this is a great example of a indeterminate work. I have no idea how to play that. I'm technologically challenged. Oh, okay. So that was just very quickly, that's a version that 3 pianists did. But a soloist could do it, or 20. I want to see it for 20. So maybe next year. Yeah. Okay. I'm sure I'm behind. So I want to go to, I think this is perhaps the most perfect example of an indeterminate work. It's my favorite John Cage piece, and we will be performing this piece on Thursday night. The work Inlets from 1977 is a piece for 12 conch shells, like the one I have up here, the sound of burning pine cones, a trumpet conch, a conch shell performed in the manner of a trumpet, and silence. And I say that this is the most perfect example of an indeterminate work for a few reasons. One is that this is the only thing the performers have to go on. There is no musical notation. He's now gone from music notation and some chance operations and some fixed ideas with performer autonomy to, here's my idea, do it. It's up to you. This is the original manuscript, but the published score today is just a scan of this. You can tell that he's puts things in parentheses, he scratches things out, and that's how it's still printed today. I have on the left, it's not as big as I thought. On the left, I typeset it so that it's sort of readable to you, but probably not. And I thought maybe I could just explain how this piece works according to Cage's instructions, which, yes, if you read the original, you have to rotate the paper and parse out his words. And so this work, written in 1977, was actually made for the Merce Cunningham Dance Company. This was music to accompany dancers, which is even stranger when you get ready to hear this. He says it's a piece of any duration, any length of time. Great. 12 water-filled conch shells. Okay, he explains that they should be different sizes. And ultimately, he says there should be one more conch shell that you play as a trumpet. He gives you a sense of the form of the piece, which essentially works like this. Each performer has 4 shells. They determine an ordering for those shells and how they'll be presented. Each shell is performed once and only once. And more or less, each performer sounds their conch shell a little bit longer, so the proportions get, longer until the end of the piece. At the midpoint of the predetermined length of your performance, at the midpoint, where does he say this? Second paragraph. Then, at any point, I can't find it. Here we go. Halfway through an agreed upon time length, a silence is developed. I love this language. It's not a silence is halfway through, it's developed. What does that even mean? Well, it means that the conch shells should gradually fade out and the silence develops out of the fading conch shells. Once you have this silence, the sound of the fire is faded in. And once everyone hears the sound of the fire, all right, the last pine cone comes in. And then it says at any time post-central in the time length, the conch shell should be sounded as a trumpet. Jeff Malecki, our department chair, will be responsible for the conch shell in his first John Cage performance. Okay, so why is this an amazing example of an indeterminate work? Well, yes, the score is very open, and the performers have an incredible latitude, a credible amount of autonomy in how they're going to present this work. But the most perfect reason that it's an indeterminate work is by the very nature of the materials and the sounds. Let me just start with the fire and get this out of the way quickly so I can finish with the shell. When you burn pine cones, as you do in this piece, oh, by the way, he says to have a real fire if possible. We will not. But it is my dream to do this piece for 24 hours on the beach one day. All right. When you burn pine cones, what's the sound? Crackle. That's the steam escaping. Cage can't plan when the crackles are going to happen, the pops, the snaps. That's the sound, though. That's why he wants the crackling fire. It's a sound that you can't plan for. And in a very similar way, the conch shells that the performers use are filled with water. And this interior of this conch shell, it's a channel that spirals again and again and again and again. If you pour water into this and spin it very slowly, the air pockets collapse. The performer has no idea when that will happen. You can't will the conch shell to gurgle. You can't know when it's going to happen. And so I've performed this piece several times, and the first time I ever played it was at a big convention, or like a conference rather, and I was doing this thing and nothing was happening, and it stressed me out. But that was in my youth. Now I think it's beautiful because you just don't know when it's going to happen. And so let me just show you, because it would just be too sad to not share this. And so we fill it, we give it a drink. It leaks a little bit. I'm sure I'm over time, right? So I'm just going to, basically, I wanted to tell you one last thing, if you give me 90 seconds. As a performer of Cage, he gives me this autonomy, but I want to respect his lineage, his ideas. So I don't just take the open autonomy that he gives me and just improvise. I am meticulous. I think that this respects the tradition of Cage. And so one of the things that I do is I use random number generators to determine every aspect of this performance. It's not me choosing, it's fate, even though this is an indeterminate work. And so I have determined via random number generator that my shells will begin at the beginning, and then at 1 minute and 44 seconds, 4 minutes and 22 seconds. The silence, again, via random number generator, will begin at 7 minutes, 12 seconds. My last shell, this one right here, will begin at 9 minutes. And Dr. Malecki, at the very end, somehow, exactly on a clean 14 minutes, I didn't choose that, we will hear the sound of the conch. The piece will end 1 minute later. So thank you so much. I hope that we've at least given you some insight about what we love and what we like to do. And we really hope that you'll get to join us on Thursday night. Thank you.